Hi, everybody. Welcome to our collaboration with the Government Accountability Office. I'm Rick Lovard, the Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange. Today's event is on brain-machine interfaces. If you don't know the National Academy of Sciences, we are a private nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that exists outside of the federal government to give the gold standard of peer-reviewed scientific advice to the nation. Normally, Ann Merchant's here to tell you all about that. Today, she couldn't join us, so I'm flying solo. I run the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences. And we've done over 3,500 consults where we are a bridge between the National Academies and Hollywood. And we consult on TV shows and video games and all sorts of documentaries and graphic novels. If you are a STEM professional and you're interested in being a part of our community, please do reach out and contact us. We're always looking for new people, new voices, new people to connect. And Sachi has some info down there to give you a little more info on how to get in touch with us. There will be a recording of this show on the Exchange's website. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to see these events and the videos after the fact. You can also sign up for our Collider newsletter and get our little tidbits of science each week that we think are interesting news stories. So this video, we're going to send out the link to everybody who RSVP'd for this event, so you'll be able to find it after the fact. I want to thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and so many individuals just like you, so many people donated today, and we really appreciate it. It goes right back into doing these events and also our live schedule of events that are restarting in Los Angeles this year. So hopefully you'll be getting some invites from us very shortly. In a moment, you're going to hear from a great speaker, Karen Howard. If you have a question at any time, you can put it in the Q&A. We've disabled the chat. We need it for our back end. Apologies for that. I know a lot of these events allow you to use the chat, not our events. But you can ask a question. And after Karen is done speaking, I'm going to be coming back on screen and getting through as many questions as humanly possible. Hopefully, we never have enough time for all of them, but hopefully we'll have a little more time than usual to get to some of your questions this week. So please do ask questions. I also should mention we had a few technical difficulties, which is why we're slightly late starting today. And if we lose our speaker, which is a possibility, she will be rejoining us by phone. So I will jump on and let you know that. But just in case it happens, please, we appreciate your patience. Thank you for your patience. My rabbit hole this week, the thing that as we were researching this event caught my attention more than anything else was a Stanford study that was for people who had trouble speaking, mostly stroke victims, I believe. There's a new device out, a brain-machine interface device that allows people to speak almost conversationally, although it is wrong apparently 20% of the time. But if you're interested in that article, I found that fascinating. So the National Academy of Sciences and the Government Accountability Office work together all the time to bring reports to Congress that shape public policy. This is the first time that the Science and Entertainment Exchange and the Government Accountability Office have collaborated, and we're hoping that it's going to be the first of many. Because honestly, this was a big learning curve for me personally. Understanding the breadth and depth of the Government Accountability Office's work was unbelievable. And we thought that Karen Howard's work in particular was a great place to start on human-machine interfaces. So hopefully you will enjoy this as much as we have. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to Jessica Smith, the Director of Operations and Communications for the Science and Tech team at the Government Accountability Offices. It's been a thrill to work with her thus far. And Jessica, I'm really excited to do more events like this with you.
Thanks so much, Rick, for having us. We're so excited also to be here. And I just want to take a moment and thank everybody who is spending the hour with us now and just paying attention to this important work. So I'm Jess Smith. I'm from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. And here in DC, we're known as the Congressional Watchdog, for those of you who don't know of us. We're known that way because we explain how taxpayer dollars are spent and how government conducts its operations. We advise lawmakers and agency heads on ways to make government work better And in a city full of partisan spin, GAO is known for providing timely analysis that's nonpartisan, fair, and balanced. In 2019, we established our Science, Technology Assessment, and Analytics team. And in our team, we're focused on really the most pressing S&T issues of our time. That can be everything from artificial intelligence to infectious diseases. It could be blockchain technology and to quantum computing. And throughout these works, our aim is not just to issue reports on these complicated topics, but really to help policymakers and the public just better understand the key questions that these technologies raise, both for government oversight and also for our society as a whole. So we're a large team of scientists in the congressional branch of government. Right now, our team is about 150 people strong, and we collectively hold at least 100 advanced STEM-related degrees just in our team. And these include everything from biology to chemistry, environmental science to engineering, mathematics, data science, and so many more. But we're here today to learn about brain-computer interfaces from Dr. Karen Howard. So let me take a minute and introduce you to her. Karen is the acting chief scientist for our agency, and she's a director within our team. She earned her doctorate in environmental chemistry from the State University of New York, and her master's degrees, plural, in analytical chemistry and education from Youngstown State University and Duquesne University, respectively. Karen earned her bachelor's degrees in biology and secondary education from Penn State University. And if that wasn't enough, before joining GAO, she taught high school chemistry and biology for 12 years. And so without further ado, let me pass the floor over to Karen.
Thank you, Jess, and welcome everybody. So as Jess mentioned, we do our work for Congress. We try to provide them with a look at current technologies, emerging technologies, try to give them some foresight into where these technologies may go in the near future in particular, and try to help them understand what some of the policy implications might be for us as a nation and for them in particular as policymakers, what they should be keeping an eye on, what they might want to be aware of. In that role, we did produce recently a report on brain-computer interfaces. And as part of that, we did also interact with innovators in this space and talk to them about the work and the kinds of challenges they're facing and the promise they see in this field. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Brain-computer interfaces, just as a brief definition, are technologies that allow somebody to control an external device, maybe a computer, a smartphone, a robotic limb, maybe their own paralyzed limb, using just their brain signals. So it's exactly what the name says. It's an interface between your brain signals and the device that you're trying to control. These devices have been explored and researched for decades. The first device that would qualify under the current definition of a BCI or a brain-computer interface appeared in the early 1970s. So 50 years or so, they've been working on these. And they've continued to advance through that time, and I can give you a little idea of the status as we move forward here. They fall into two basic categories. There are BCIs that are wearable, where basically the user is wearing a cap or a headset of some sort that is reading their brain signals from outside the skull, very similar to an EEG, an electroencephalogram, that might put patches with wires, electrodes on the brain in order to read those brain signals. So a very similar system to that. So those are the wearable BCIs. The second category are implanted BCIs, where they actually do surgery on the skull and they implant the interface directly either on the surface or into the brain tissue itself. They're also sometimes called invasive BCIs. So sometimes they divide them as non-invasive and invasive. I've also seen invasive divided into two subcategories. If the probes or the electrodes go down into the brain tissue, they're called fully invasive. And if it lays on the surface of the brain, they're called partially invasive. So in either case, those require brain surgery in order to apply them. So something to know about the status, the wearable ones, the ones that are accessed outside of the skull through a cap or a headset of some sort, those do not require, as we mentioned, they don't require surgery. They have some different challenges to them, and those are available on the market for some purposes currently. The implantable ones require obviously FDA, Food and Drug Administration regulatory action. So those are medical devices. Anytime you're implanting something in somebody's brain, clearly the Food and Drug Administration is going to be involved in approving those devices for safety. And all of those devices at the current time are in clinical trials. So they're being tested in real patients. They're being implanted in real patients and tested to see how well they work, how effective they are in treating the conditions they're intended to treat. But those are not yet available on the market. They are still in the clinical trial stage. So I just wanted you to be aware of that distinction. What kinds of things can a BCI be used for? The original research on this was nearly all focused on medical applications. So somebody had had a stroke, they had lost control of one of their limbs maybe, or they had limited control. And this was an attempt to try to help them control that paralyzed limb again. Perhaps they were retraining a different part of their brain using the brain-computer interface. Perhaps they were controlling a external sort of a wraparound device that wraps around their arm, and they can control that in order to move their arm. So they almost all had medical applications in the early stages. The applications continue in the medical area. It's certainly a major area of research and a focus of a lot of the innovative work that's going on in this field. But there are also applications now outside the medical space where, for example, to give you a few governmental applications, NASA is looking into brain-computer interfaces as a way of using brain signals to determine when pilots might be less attentive or might be more likely to make a mistake, or air traffic controllers is another application that they're using it for. So they're learning to interpret brain signals in order to know the status of the worker and whether the air traffic controller or the pilot is getting tired, getting more likely to make a mistake. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, is also researching these devices as possible ways for a pilot someday to control an airplane. So you can imagine, for example, a disabled pilot might use a brain-computer interface to fly a plane. Instead of being able to manually control the levers or the pedals to make the plane operate the way a normally abled person would, somebody could use a brain-computer interface in order to fly that plane. And so that's something the FAA is looking into. If these devices were able at some point in the future to give that capability, how would they, as the FAA, certify that the pilot was using the device properly and was able to safely operate a plane using this device? Obviously, agencies have to think ahead. They have to think, where might this technology go and what do we need to be ready to regulate? So agencies are thinking in that direction. The Department of Defense is also researching these devices, brain-computer interfaces. Some of the potential applications, for example, you might imagine the possibility of a soldier controlling a drone using a BCI, where they're moving across a section of terrain with their group of soldiers. They want to hold their weapon in their hands, but they also want to control a drone that's out ahead of the group, maybe scouting for the group, watching for danger. A brain-computer interface might be a way to control that drone hands-free so that they have their hands available to hold their weapon. So those are some of the ideas that we heard about as we were doing the research on this. There are, of course, concerns with BCIs, and let me just cover those quickly before we move into the question and answer space. Naturally, there are concerns about privacy with people's brain data. We currently don't have any way to use somebody's brain data if we capture it, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be usable sometime in the future, that we won't figure out a way to use that brain data. So the privacy of people's brain data, just like any other biological or health data, your brain data is very personal and it's very private. And so we need to make sure that we secure that data. The BCIs that use wireless technology, particularly to communicate between the BCI and the device, they would be more prone to hacking than the ones that are directly wired between the device and the cap or the headset that's being used. So there are concerns about hacking. Could somebody hack into it? If they hacked into it, could they store the data until we develop the capability as a global society to interpret or use that data in some way? So that's a concern. There are also concerns about the safety of implanted BCIs in particular. How safe is it to have something inserted into your brain tissue and left there? There are other insertable brain devices, so we do have some data medically on how the brain responds to such things, but we don't necessarily have a complete set of data. So that's something where there's some research underway to try to understand that better. There are also concerns about what you do when the BCI doesn't give the right result. So brain-computer interfaces train on the data of the individual user, and we each have very unique brain data. If I tell my hand to reach out and grab a glass of water that's on the table, the brain signals I use to tell my hand to do that are different than the signals you would use to tell your hand to do that. We all have a unique way of thinking and a unique set of brain signals and brain neural pathways that we use. So the BCI is not just a plug and play device. You can't just put one on and it automatically knows what your brain signals are trying to tell it to do. There's a training period. And particularly when you're trying to do something very complex, maybe very fine motor skills or something that's that has a lot more steps involved to it, there's going to be more training involved so that the BCI can learn through an artificial intelligence type mechanism. It learns your brain signals and it learns what you mean by those. So if you can imagine somebody who is perhaps unable to speak and is trying to sign a contract or give consent for a medical procedure, they might use a brain-computer interface to indicate, yes, I approve, or no, I don't. But what if the BCI gets it wrong? And that could happen, certainly. And in some of the trials, they've shown that it's not perfect technology, particularly not in the early stages. But even after it's well trained on a person's neurobiology, it doesn't always get the right answer. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with them making mistakes that could sometimes be very consequential? So those are some of the concerns that we encountered as we did our work. And so we wrote at the end of our short report some things that people could think about, policymakers in particular could think about with these. For medical applications, how expensive are these going to be? Who's going to have access to them? Will insurance cover them? Will all patients, regardless of how affluent they are, be able to access these if they need them? So there's a lot of questions there. And this is a very common question with medical technologies. As new medical advances are made, it's not always quick to get insurance to agree to pay for them, because often they're viewed as experimental for quite some period of time, even after they're on the market. So insurance companies can be slow to pick up coverage for them. And even once they do pick up coverage, it's not always true that everybody gets equitable coverage. So that's one of the questions. Will there be inequities created? Will some people who have more money be able to afford this technology and others not be able to? I mentioned the security and privacy concerns. There's also an ethical framework to think about. So if you can imagine being able to train your brain to control a device, it's possible that you could not only regain control of your own limb after a stroke, let's say, but perhaps people would be thinking toward enhancing their physical capabilities beyond the normal human capability, maybe giving yourself additional strength or additional speed through using your brain to control a mechanical device of some sort. And some researchers are already working on that. They're already thinking about those possibilities and where they might be able to take this technology. Is that ethical? Is it ethical to enhance the human body well beyond what it would typically be able to do? And think about that perhaps in a war scenario, a battle scenario. What if an adversary was able to outfit an army with devices that made their soldiers much faster, much stronger, less likely to get tired? Perhaps the brain-computer interface, in some cases, they're bidirectional, right? It's not just a signal out from the brain to the device, but you can have signals back to the brain from the device. That can have very good uses. For example, when we reach out to grab that glass of water on the table, part of the reason that we know to close our hand and pick it up is because not only can we see that our hand has reached the right place on the table, but we can feel the glass. And so that bidirectional allows the sensation of touching the glass to come back to the brain so that the user knows to close the hand, for example, the mechanical hand in this case, as we're imagining. So bidirectionality can be good, but it can also be used to influence the brain. So what if you could train a soldier not to have fear? What if you could feed back and short circuit that fear mechanism so that they would go into any kind of dangerous situation without that normal human protective fear response? Or what if you could change the level of anger that they feel toward their adversary? You can imagine how quickly this might spiral into some areas that have some real ethical concerns. So those are some of the things we suggested that policymakers think about as these technologies continue to advance. And with that, let me stop and send it back to Rick, and I think we can start the Q&A.
All right, excellent. Karen, first, I just got to selfishly ask a question for myself, which is, what are a couple of scenarios you could see yourself, knowing what you know, getting a brain computer interface, both sort of medically and non-medical. Are there scenarios where you could see getting one for yourself?
That's a great question. One of the easy yeses for me is in the case of a medical situation that caused a loss of control of your limbs, for example, a stroke. One of the neat devices that recently got FDA approval, one of the first medical devices actually that got FDA approval for marketing, is a device that's designed, it's a sort of mechanical hand and arm, almost an elbow length glove kind of mechanical device. And it's connected to a brain computer interface, and it's used to teach the other side of your brain to control your limb after a stroke. So many of us are aware that if you have a stroke, if the stroke happens on the left side of the brain, for example, then the right side of the body is likely to experience some level of paralysis. In order to regain control of that limb, once the brain tissue on the left side is no longer able to do it, you can actually use a brain computer interface to teach the right side of your brain to control the right side of your body. It takes time. It takes some therapy, some physical therapy, and some working with this device or something like it. But that's a situation where I could see using one in order to regain normal function. For me personally, I can't imagine using it to take my physical capabilities beyond what they would normally be, but that's perhaps my limited imagination.
So you're not running out for that Apple product that helps you with email?
I don't think so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I love Tom's question. I'm going to lead with that. Tom wants to know about, and I think we've all had this experience where we've bought a product from a company and then found 5 years later that product becomes unsupported by that company. Are there people considering that concern for these things that are going to be actually implanted?
So we have not heard that in our research, but generally speaking, in the field of medical devices, if devices are implanted, the user is granted or expected to be granted some level of follow-up, right? So if a device becomes unworkable, they can get a replacement. It can be removed depending on what the circumstance is. That happens in lawsuit cases, for example, where they discover that a device is causing harm that they didn't realize would occur until after devices are implanted. So there is a regulatory control over medical devices long-term that are implanted in the body, things like pacemakers, things along those lines. For the wearables or the non-medical applications, that tends to be more of a buyer beware market, right? And things do become obsolete. And I don't know that there's been a lot of thought given to that. We did not hear much about that.
So Gord asks about the actual implant itself, actually, along these lines, and that concerns about the brain developing scar tissue or the interface not working after some period of time. Is that something that you heard about?
So I think that's always possible, right, with a medical device. We did not hear any specific cases where that was true, but I suspect concerns on the part of the FDA over whether that might occur might be one reason that these devices are still in clinical trials for a lengthy period of time. Obviously, if you're working in the brain, that's a very sensitive part of the body. We can't afford for things to go wrong there. So I suspect the clinical trial process might be a little longer than they would be for an implanted device elsewhere in the body.
Kevin has a great question. It's pretty specific, so I don't know if you've heard of this specifically, but he asked about AI-assisted BCI for therapy involving OCD, where patients were reporting losing some sense of selfhood. Is something like that, or other studies that are similar, where are there ethical issues presented with that, with patients losing other senses, I guess?
So that's an interesting question, and not a specific circumstance that we heard about, or that I heard about at least as we were doing this work. I will note that you do sometimes, and I'm not quite sure what direction the questioner is heading with this, but there are some blurry lines between BCIs and other technologies. So there's another set of technologies called neuromodulation, or sometimes it's called neurostimulation, that is designed to affect the brain and the way we think through giving it feedback. So for example, I met with an innovator at a conference who is working with a headset that looks, very much like a VR headset that is trying to control PTSD through the sounds and the light patterns that they send through the headset to the user. That would not be considered a brain-computer interface in the classical sense. It's a device that's intending to affect the brainwaves, so there is a connection there, but the control, using the brainwaves to control a device is not quite as clearly there. So this is a place where the lines get a little blurry, and I'm not familiar with the OCD devices, which side of that line they fall on.
That's fair. So Lucas wants to know about sort of more broadly, as this becomes commercialized in the near future, do you think the market's going to be really fragmented, or do you think that big platforms are going to be, is it going to be like the App Store, I guess, Lucas? Forgive me if I just murdered your question.
That's another great question. I suspect we know that currently the market for wearable devices, which are the only ones that are currently marketable, is roughly $2.5 billion a year right now, and increasing in the single low double digit percentages. So 12, 13% a year increasing. So there is a significant market for this already. It will probably continue to grow. The wearable devices right now are largely used for non-medical purposes. Not entirely, but largely. So a lot of gaming, some of those kinds of uses of them. In terms of whether the market will become fragmented, I think that's more likely in the wearable non-medical space than it is in the medical space. I suspect in the medical space that the regulatory process is going to be such a heavy lift for companies to get through the clinical trial and approval process that tends to consolidate the market rather than allowing it to expand.
So, I mean, do you think that there are going to be products, when you talk about sort of like first movers, that are going to give some people, a lot of this gets into a conversation about equity, I think, an unfair advantage in certain areas over other people? What are some areas of concern there, if indeed that is an area of concern?
My guess, and nobody has a crystal ball, right? So I can't say exactly where the future will go on these, but my guess is that in the early years, potentially for a significant amount of time, these are going to be rather expensive products that are going to be fairly niche markets. They're going to be like hoverboards when they came out, right? They were cool, they were flashy, everybody knew what they were, but very few people actually bought one. And I think the same thing will happen here. I think it will be a fairly small market at first. If at some point the applications become so compelling, they improve our lives so much in some way, and they aren't just a toy or a neat gee whiz thing to play with, then I could see the market broadening considerably and a far greater slice of the population becoming interested in them.
So Uma wants to know about the data, and I mean, you touched on privacy a bit, but she's worried in particular about, like, our insurance company is going to make decisions based on data about our thoughts, or loan approval and employment. She's just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
It's a great question. I suspect eventually regulators will loop them in with other privacy laws that don't allow those kinds of data to be used. So you can go to the doctor and be tested to see if you have the genes that predispose you to breast cancer, for example, and insurance companies cannot use those results to raise your premiums just because you might be more at risk because of your genetic profile. That's written into law. I suspect in those kinds of cases, similar laws or addendums to laws would be written to prevent the use of that for those purposes.
Yeah, so Chris wants to know, I think a logical extension of of Uma's question is, will they be able to really read and represent thoughts? And then, of course, I go to, when am I going to see movies in my dreams?
So in terms of mind reading, we all go there, right? Can they read my mind and tell everything I'm thinking at every moment? The answer to that currently is a clear and resounding no. They absolutely cannot do that. All they can do is try to interpret what mechanical motion, for the most part, you are trying to send, what signal you are trying to send to move a device, to click on a virtual keyboard so that you can spell out words, to do something like that. It's not that they're reading everything you're thinking. There's too much going on in the brain for that. The probes have to be placed in a certain place. They're normally placed in a place that will allow them to read the signals that do something in particular, like move your arm or move your leg or something along those lines. They're not reading your whole brain and interpreting everything that's going on in your mind at any given time. Could we get there someday? Maybe, but we're very, very far from that now.
So, so Jay Craig's asking a question around keyboards and mice and accessing devices. Do you see it replacing potentially like point and click, but maybe not like transcribing email with just thoughts, or is that where do you see as like the low hanging fruit versus the the self-driving car we're all promised that's maybe further out than we think?
Another great question. I think most of the research that's underway right now, and we don't have specific numbers on this, right? How many studies on each thing, but the bulk of the focus of the research seems to be dealing with paralysis and dealing with communication. So people who can't speak, or who are, paralyzed and can't type, or otherwise access the normal communication devices that we all use. There is a lot of research going into allowing BCIs to let somebody text on a smartphone, let somebody make a call on a smartphone. As I said, sending a signal to a virtual keyboard so that you can click on, the letters you want to spell something out. There's a lot of work going on in that area. And I think that will continue to be a focal area.
So Megan's asking about why not, as long as we're able to help, differently abled people and enhance their capabilities, and perhaps even give them abilities that, we, without those encumbrances, may have. Like, where's the line in your mind between, okay, now we're giving people superpowers, and now we're getting, is it about allowing somebody who isn't able to do certain normal, what one might consider, an able-bodied person to easily be able to do? Is it about getting them to a level playing field, or are we really trying to raise the bar? And where's that line for you?
I don't know that I know where my line is, right? I think as a society, though, we've seen over and over that there is broad societal acceptance to help people regain lost function, or to bring them into the mainstream where they can function fully in society, where they can fully participate and not be excluded from anything. I think when you start to cross that line, though, society as a whole starts to get really nervous and starts to pull back. And just as an example, to give you an example of that, think about the Blade Runner, right? So people who are amputees, who replaced their lower limbs with a prosthetic that's blade shaped and that allows them to run, for example, in the Olympics. And we remember Oscar Pistorius, right? And others. Society is okay with that if it brings it up to a level playing field. But as soon as it starts to feel like it conveys an unfair advantage, particularly in a competitive arena like sports, people start to get very uncomfortable and pull back. And I suspect as a society, we just sort of have an internal regulatory mechanism that doesn't like that to happen. I think we have to think as a society, though, about people who have nefarious intent and who will not stop at those societal comfort lines, and who will try to push past them for reasons of their own.
And where do you think some of the obvious places that, Lex Luthor is going to potentially want to get a BCI because, Lex Luthor can then do X, Y, Z? Where are some of the things that for you are cause for concern?
I don't know, as a scientist, if I'm as imaginative as a lot of the people that are probably in this webinar and could think of a lot of areas where that might go. I can think of a few, though. I can imagine somebody, for example, wanting to have, let's say, a bodyguard force, a protective force, an army, however large a scale we want to imagine, that has, faster firing ability with their weapons, that is stronger, doesn't get tired as fast, that maybe can be can learn not to be afraid and not to have that initial hesitation. I can see lots of areas in that realm where somebody might be thinking and working toward, could we get to that stage, because that would give me an advantage over my adversary. I could definitely imagine that.
So we have a number of questions about Alzheimer's. Are you aware of ways in which BCI may impact Alzheimer's research?
So we did not include any Alzheimer's examples in our report. And I think one of the reasons, and this is probably not the only reason, but one reason is that we really still don't understand Alzheimer's very well. We don't understand fully what causes it. We don't understand how to treat it. That's why we don't have a good treatment. Most of the treatments medically that have been geared toward Alzheimer's have been geared toward preventing the formation of the brain plaques that form in Alzheimer's or removing them after they have been formed. And many of those treatments are not working well in clinical trials. So that's an indicator that we probably don't really understand all of the complexity of what causes Alzheimer's. Until we know that, until we understand the mechanism, there's really, it would be very difficult to target a BCI toward addressing those concerns.
D. Gupta has a question I think is interesting. So we addressed companies deciding not to support a medical product that has been implanted in your brain. What if that company goes bankrupt? Is this something that FDA or policy considers before people start getting these devices implanted?
We did not look specifically at that as part of our work, but I would say I don't think in this case a BCI is any different than a pacemaker or any other implanted device where the company that implants it could go bankrupt, particularly if it's found to have a flaw and they get sued by, a million people who got that device. I think it's never a perfect risk-free world, right? But we did not look at any specific cases of liability.
So DN is asking about Neuralink, which I think is Elon Musk famously funded and is probably the best known of these kinds of private companies. I may be wrong about that, but I'm seeing you nod. So there you go. They're asking specifically what's your opinion on Neuralink, but I would broaden that question out a little bit to say, there are a lot of private companies that are doing a lot of interesting things. Like, what's your sort of state on where, broadly where some of these private companies are going? What do you think is interesting right now?
So to the extent, the main gatekeeper that I want to keep emphasizing, to the extent that we're talking about implantable devices, they've got to go through FDA. They have to get FDA approval. So that's a very rigorous regulatory process. It takes many years to get a device through clinical trials. And so, it's one thing to say we're going to have a device implanted in somebody in 6 months, which I believe I have read Elon Musk has said about Neuralink. That requires approval. Just to put it into patients requires approval. But even then, getting from there to market is often a many-year process with heavy regulatory steps along the way. In terms of what's promising, I think there's a lot out there that's promising. I think we have the potential to really make a difference in the lives of people who right now are not able to fully participate in society one way or another, whether it's movement, whether it's communication, whether it's activities that they would like to be able to do and cannot because of stroke or paralysis or a variety of other conditions. That to me is the really exciting space. For me, I'm a scientist, and so that's where I tend to think I just don't get as excited about the gaming applications and the things along those lines. They're fun, they're useful, there's going to be a market for those, there's no doubt. But to me, that's not where the real promise lies. The real promise is in truly changing people's lives.
So we have a number of people who are asking the classic Hollywood writers question, looking at you, Chris, asking about what about actually controlling somebody's brain with one of these things? How far away are you worried about that? I know you've talked about security. That seems like that's the movie that writes itself right there. So what are your thoughts on that as a concept?
It's certainly possible down the road, right? We're not anywhere near that point yet. But when we have a bidirectional BCI where the signal can go both ways, and as I said earlier, there are some good, benign, valuable reasons to do that, to have signals going back into the brain. But once you can do that, particularly for wireless devices, they become hackable. And at that point, what signals could you send to somebody? And that is a concern, I think. Has it ever happened? No, we're not at that point yet, right? Where somebody could send signals back and control somebody's brain or their own movement, right? Could you make them throw themselves off a cliff by sending signals back in the other direction? We're nowhere near that point, but I do think as a society, we have to be aware of that and concerned about it and figure out how to put the guardrails in place as best we can to prevent those kinds of harms.
So I had to Google hydrocephalus. Are you familiar with this as a brain condition at all, Karen? Because there's a question involving BCIs and that particular condition.
So I am very loosely aware of what hydrocephalus is. I am not aware of applications of BCIs in that space.
Okay. So sorry, Sandra. So what about BCIs as they work perhaps in concert, I suppose, with other movement controls like eye movements or blinks? Is this something, are there people working on those kinds of devices?
So I think we already have devices in that realm, right? And again, this is outside the scope of our work, so I'm not going to be able to go very far with this answer, but we have devices that already interpret those things. There are devices, for example, that sense the tracking of your eyes. Some of the devices in your car that tell you the driver needs to stop for coffee are tracking your eye movement, right? And they're figuring out that your eyes aren't where they're supposed to be, or they're staying too long off to the side, looking at, the deer you just drove by, or something like that. So some of that eye tracking already exists, even in spheres where we're not aware of it. But in terms of the link between that and BCIs, that goes outside the work we did.
So Donna has a question that I'm not sure applies, but I love the creativity of it. And so I'm going to ask it to you anyway, Karen. So forgive me in advance. Sorry, Donna, if I called you out here, but so she's referencing an episode of Alias, the TV show that was on maybe, 15 years ago. And I guess in that episode, they were using the unique signature of a person's brain waves to serve as a way of locating an individual. And she wants to know if there's any truth to this idea that there may be a unique signature to the way your brain waves are operating that could then be used as an identifier.
So in broad terms, yes, we all give off different brain signals. In specifics for trying to imagine how a device like that might work for tracking purposes, it would have to have the data on your brain signals already to compare it to. So it would have to know what set of brain signals it was looking for, and it would have to have a way to read those from a distance, because tracking would require being able to read it from a distance. Currently, neither of those technologies exists. Could it exist down the road? Possibly.
I love plausible, plausible but far. I'm so sorry, DM. I'm not going to be able to pronounce your first name, but I love your question. So we talked about Alzheimer's briefly. What about other ways that this may support a better lifestyle, greater longevity, greater ability for the elderly to do things like live in their own home, just have a better quality of life? What are some areas that excite you?
So I don't think we came across very many applications in that specific area, in just normal aging, right? I think most of the applications that are currently being researched are more geared toward the stroke and paralysis realm, for example. But I could imagine the potential for it to be used for example, I could imagine a BCI being helpful for helping somebody who was having balance issues, right? One of the issues with the elderly living in their own homes is that the older we get, the worse our balance gets, and the harder it is for us to not fall, right? Falls become more problematic. And perhaps there would be a way to design a BCI that would allow you to control your motion, your walking motion and so on, with more stability and more balance than you can naturally do on your own, which might allow you to age in your own home more gracefully. As I said, we did not come across any applications like that, but I could imagine it being something like that being developed.
Yeah, I'd imagine for someone with like osteoporosis or something, that preventing a fall in that way would be a huge difference.
Yes. Yeah, falls are the main reason people end up in nursing homes. They fall and they can no longer function then in their own environment.
So Matson wants to know, it's hard, he said, it's hard to verify claims that commercial companies are making about non-invasive products that are on the market currently. Is there a sense of whether or how the government will regulate or standardize the way we validate these products that are coming on the market, and the veracity of the claims?
That is a really interesting question. I could imagine regulatory agencies getting involved if they think there's a public safety angle. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be a medical application, but if they think that there's a reason that false claims would lead to public safety concerns, I could see them getting involved with that.
Dave has an interesting question. So we've talked about how these BCIs can interact with motor skills, but what about other systems? And specifically, Dave references the endocrine system.
So I know for sure we don't talk about that in our report, and I'm not aware that we came across any information on that, on the brain controlling hormonal function. Now, I will say, that said, there are already devices that control, for example, insulin pumps, right? Automated insulin pumps that type 1 diabetics can wear to keep their insulin under control. Those have to be adjusted periodically. They have to be calibrated periodically. There could be a way for those to be integrated with a BCI, or something that delivers some other endocrine component to be integrated with a BCI. But as I said, we didn't come across anything like that in our research.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I'm now in a bit of catch up. Well, I've got two low-hanging fruit questions here. Susan wants to know, which SUNY campus did you go to? And Norbert would like to know, who's your favorite sci-fi writer?
Wow. So I went to SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry, which is in Syracuse. It is attached to and affiliated with Syracuse University, but it is a SUNY campus. My PhD is in environmental chemistry. So that was a very logical campus for me to go to. And my favorite sci-fi writer, I know this is not the right thing to say to this crowd, but I actually don't read much sci-fi, so I don't have a good answer for you there. I like Jules Verne, although I realize not a modern writer.
Solid. Are you familiar with neuromodulation?
Loosely, yes, but not in great detail.
So David would like to know why neuromodulation and BCIs are being billed separately, and perhaps for those among us guilty right here who don't know what it is, if you could maybe say your loose definition.
Sure. So they're been separately by some people. Let me be clear that the definitions are different depending on who you talk to. So in our report, we separated those to a significant degree. BCIs, as we define them, are the brain controlling a device, and sometimes with a bidirectional feedback back into the brain, like the touch that we talked about before. Neuromodulation is actually designed the other direction. It's designed to influence the brain. So you send signals that affect the brain patterns, the neurological processes that are going on in the brain. I mentioned one earlier. One of the innovators I encountered at a conference is doing that using neuromodulation through a VR headset to help control PTSD. So it's in my mind, they're different because the intention is different. A brain-computer interface is intended to control something out predominantly, and a neuromodulation is intended to control in. That's the only distinction I have for it. But there are lots of other definitions that are perfectly valid.
Okay, I think an extension of that, Kieran and Jack have similar questions. Kieran wants to know about the clinical applications for BCI, and Jack specifically wants to know about addiction. Is it being used to help with fighting addiction?
The addiction question is fascinating. My husband was actually an addiction counselor for 25 years. I had not thought of it in that angle. I don't believe we came across studies on that. I know for sure they're not in our report. And I don't think we came across them either, but I could easily see it being used for that purpose, right? More perhaps in the neuromodulation sense, the affecting the way our brains think and operate, than in the outward direction that we're thinking of with a BCI. But yes, I could imagine it being used in that space. And I lost your other question, Rick.
So it was more generally clinically, and I think we've got Patrick asking about bipolar disorder.
So I don't know much, and we didn't research much about psychological applications. Again, I think those would be more in the neuromodulation space than in the BCI space, as I'm defining them, the outwardly directing versus inwardly trying to affect the way the brain is functioning. Clinical applications of BCIs, the way we're describing them, currently have been predominantly focused on dealing with paralysis, recovery from stroke, things along those lines. The paralysis may or may not be stroke related. So there are other reasons, of course, that people become paralyzed. and stroke recovery. A lot of the clinical trial type of work that's underway now is in that area. Not all of it necessarily, but a lot of it.
So Nicole's asking about accessibility and economics and equity, basically. And I know we already touched on this, but is there something to underline or expound upon when it comes to the differentiation between the ultra rich having access to a medical device and the ultra rich having access to a device that might give them an edge in, let's say, law school?
So you're asking if there are different equity concerns between those two categories of inequity, basically.
Yeah, I don't think we touched on that. I think we may have touched on the equity question more generally. But
yeah, it's an interesting question. Based on our historical record in the US and where the regulatory process tends to go, I would think there would be more likely to be governmental intervention to make sure that people who need medical care get it, right, regardless of their ability to pay. So whether that comes in the form of requiring insurance companies to cover something, or making sure that public insurance programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and so on cover these devices, there's usually a way for the government to intervene in the market and drive insurance companies toward coverage for something that has a proven medical effectiveness. When you're talking about something more like giving me an advantage for getting into law school, then you start to fall into the category of like SAT prep, right? Or MCAT prep, and the government typically does not intervene in those types of situations. It's much more likely to be, who the marketplace is out there, it functions on its own. Some can afford it, some can't. And there's less, I've seen historically, less governmental intervention in that space.
PK is wondering where the public can have a look at the GAO report, which I don't know if we've actually provided a link.
That's a great question. The GAO report is publicly available. And if you just do a Google search on GAO brain computer interface, I suspect it'll pop up. I don't know if there's a place that the actual link could be added to the Q&A box or something else that the audience can see, but it is certainly publicly available.
There you go. There's a link right there. Thank you, Jessica. Let's see. We have just a couple more questions yet. I guess I should ask you the obligatory, was there something we didn't get to in this that you wanted to discuss before I just get to a few more questions? You've been very efficient, by the way, answering these questions.
Well, thank you. I don't think you missed anything. It was a very thorough discussion. The one thing that really intrigues me as I look forward, and this is because it comes up in a lot of our work, is the concept of potentially hacking brain signals, hacking these devices, right, to collect brain signals and storing them in case they might be useful someday. And just to give a real world analysis, analogy of this, I guess, we know, for example, that we have adversary nations, China as one, that have hacked a lot of our data, encrypted data, and storing it. They have no way to get into it right now because the encryption is too strong. But this is a whole nother topic, but quantum computers will eventually get us to the point that a lot of the cryptographic methods we use now will become breakable. And the thinking is that China and other adversaries are storing those data until the day that the technology gets to the point that they can be decrypted. Same kind of idea could easily happen with brain data, right? People, once we get the ability to hack it and store it, then you just hold on to it until the technology gets us to the point where we can use it for something. So it's an interesting question, and it intrigues me.
Oh, that is also terrifying.
Yes.
Harris asks, what is the frequency range currently used by BCIs? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay. And we had a couple people asking about tinnitus or tinnitus, depending on your politics on how that's pronounced. Do you know if there's anything around tinnitus and BCIs? I
do not.
Okay. Okay, let's get, I'm just trying to get to the last couple ones. We've only got a minute left. By the way, great questions, everybody. So Genevieve, you're going to get the last question. Do you see the market for BCIs? Oh no, being more in the, sorry, my screen jumped, being more in the private sector or the public sector? And if they are private sector, are you concerned about regulating?
I think the market, meaning the who buys them and how, will be more in the private sector. And I think that's typically true even for the medical market, right? It's typically private sector driven. However, if it's medical, it will be regulated. And in many cases, applications in other fields will also be regulated. For example, the use of BCIs to fly a plane, just to give one example, those are going to be regulated just like any other pilot certification would be. So the market, mostly private, the regulation, though, definitely being involved in certain spheres.
Well, Karen, thank you for the work that you're doing at the Government Accountability Office. I'm also just so thrilled to be connected to you. I thought this was fascinating. I noticed we've kept almost the entire audience, so I think they found it fascinating as well. I look forward to doing more events with you, and maybe our next one will be on quantum computers now that you've
Sounds great. Thank you for inviting us. We've really enjoyed it.
Thanks. And Jessica, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, this all sounds great. Thank you so much for having us, Rick.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you real soon.